From a planning perspective to write a successful, fundable NIH grant in the new year. That is exactly what we are talking about today. So if you're new around here, I'm Sarah Dobson. I'm a research grant consultant, and my team and I help early career researchers get funded at NIH. All right, so let's talk about what it actually takes to plan out a successful, fundable NIH grant so that you can start taking the steps that you need to prepare for a really great new year when you are writing your grants. So in previous sessions, we've talked about overwhelm and how to combat overwhelm in the planning process. And I highly recommend that you go and watch that just to deal with that side of things. But today we're really talking about what do you need to do to plan for success? So let's dive right in. Number one, and this will not be a surprise to you if you've been around here for a while. Number one is to start early, okay? Most of the early career researchers that I work with and speak with start too late, way too late. And what that ends up doing is condensing the amount of time that they have available to really think through what they're doing and to figure out how to communicate that clearly and persuasively to their reviewers, which is ultimately what gets you funded. So the earlier you start, the more sort of spaciousness you have to be able to do that deep thinking that's going to allow you to clearly communicate the value of your research idea. So starting early is hugely, hugely, hugely important. And the other thing that starting early allows you to do is sort of compensate when things go sideways, because things are definitely going to go sideways. And remember that you are also writing this grant or these grants in the context of all of the other stuff that you are doing. And when you try to cram it all into a really short period that's really close to the deadline, it means that you're dropping everything else and just focusing on getting this grant out the door, which leads to, burnout and a long recovery period. And you just end up in this really terrible sort of burnout, recover cycle, right? So if you start earlier, it's a lot easier to schedule and plan your grant writing in a way that is more realistic based on the schedule that you already have. I also highly recommend that you do an audit of your schedule and your commitments so that you are really prioritizing the grant writing and publication work that you need to do to really make your impact with your research. That is another video for another time, but those two things, I just want you to recognize that starting early and kind of fitting it into a more realistic schedule is a really, really important part of the process and goes hand in hand with sort of limiting what actually gets on your schedule in the first place. But we're going to talk about that another time. So step number 2 when it comes to writing a successful fundable grant is to solidify and validate your research idea. So what do I mean by validate? Validating is about making sure that you are on solid conceptual ground, right? It's about making sure that you are not writing an entire grant application and then realizing that the conceptual foundation that you've based your application on, the scientific premise of what you're doing isn't shaky, right? You want to make sure that when you are preparing your application that you have really strong justification for the research question that you're asking or the intervention that you're implementing, right? And so you want to sort of validate that, first of all, by really understanding the conversations that are happening in the literature around this topic, but also by asking colleagues and by, passing on the question to a program officer at NIH so that you're really understanding how this idea might fit into the mission and priorities of your target funding institute, right? That's a really sort of strategic way to think about your research idea. And that's hugely important if you want to be successfully funded at NIH. This is something that I recommend that you do by starting with your specific aims page. So it's really sort of a high-level conceptual overview of your project. And if you start there and sort of look at that as more of a blueprint for what you're doing, that will then allow you to get that early feedback that you need and make any adjustments early in the process so that you haven't gone down a particular rabbit hole and find yourself in a situation where it's really, a bit too late to turn things around. So again, step number 2 is really about solidifying your research idea and validating that idea, both in terms of how you're going to justify the scientific premise of what you're doing, and making sure that you are getting some sort of indication that it is aligned with the mission and priorities of your target funding institute or center. Okay. Step number 3 is to build a strong team with clearly defined roles. One of the biggest mistakes that I see in most NIH applications is an over-reliance on descriptions of the expertise of your research team, with very little context around roles and responsibilities, right? So you're really talking up how much of an expert all of these co-Is and collaborators are, but you're not actually describing what they're doing on the project. And that is a big red flag. And that really leaves it to your reviewers to kind of put those puzzle pieces together and figure it out for themselves. And you never want to make your reviewers put together any puzzle pieces and come to their own conclusions, right? So you really want to make sure that not only you are building a team that has clearly defined unique roles and responsibilities, but that you're also clearly communicating that in the different documents within your NIH grant, okay? Number 4 is to establish a grant writing project plan so that you stay on track. And again, this one might seem obvious when we're talking about how to plan for success, how to plan to be funded. But truly, I think that it's easy to underestimate how important it is to actually map out a plan for your grant writing instead of just sort of working on it when you feel like it and kind of chipping away at it over time. Once you actually map out a plan and try to plug that plan into your existing schedule, you're going to see how little time you actually have, which is why it's so important to do that, right? And taking it back to point number 1, why it's so important to start early, right? So if you're able to really lay out a project management plan for your grant application and then make sure that you have dedicated, protected time to actually work on that grant application, that's going to get you a lot closer to getting it out the door on time with as little stress as possible. Right? So it's really, really, really important to establish that grant writing project management plan so that you can get it out the door on time with as little stress as possible. And the other piece of that, of course, is setting milestones to help you determine whether you're on track or off track based on the submission deadlines and when you expect things to be completed as part of that process, right? This is pretty standard project management skills, but those do really come into play in a big way when you are working on such a massive application. So figure out a project management system that works really well for you, and then just make sure that you're actually using that system, okay? Step number 5, get feedback at various stages of the process. So we've already talked about getting feedback on that early sort of conceptual overview of your application, which is very, very important to make sure that you're headed in the right direction when you do actually start writing your full application. But that's not the only time that you need to actually get feedback, of course, right? You definitely need to get feedback at later stages in the process when you have developed a bit more of the application in more detail. Because remember, that high-level conceptual overview doesn't tell the full story. It should give a fairly robust snapshot of what it is that you're doing, but there's still details that need to be fleshed out and explained. And you need to make sure that you're getting feedback on that from colleagues, from, of course, your co-investigators, and anyone else who can provide a unique perspective on the persuasiveness of your application, right? It's really important not only to get feedback from the sort of scientific and technical merit side of things, which of course is crucially important in any one of these NIH grants, but it's also really important to get feedback on how clear that idea is coming across and how persuasive a case you've made for why your research deserves to be funded, why you have the right team in place to do the work, and why your project is feasible, right? And those two things are actually separate, the scientific merit piece and then the grantsmanship piece. So you actually need to get feedback on both of those things. And so make sure that you establish early on who you're going to ask. And it doesn't have to be the same person. In fact, it's probably a lot less burdensome if you ask different people who have different lenses and different areas of expertise to provide feedback on different parts of the application. But it's really important that you get as much feedback as you can from these different perspectives. And again, remember, this all feeds back into point number one about starting early. To be able to get feedback that you can actually use and implement, you need to figure out who those people are early on, and you need to give them a heads up about when you're going to be requesting the feedback and to give them enough time to actually take a look and provide thoughtful comments and recommendations, and then more time for you to actually be able to implement that feedback, right? So that all takes a lot of time. And if you're writing your grant at the last minute, nobody's going to have time to support you and to give you the feedback that you're looking for, right? So again, another really great reason to start early and to map this all out and make sure that you have a plan to get feedback along the way, not just at the beginning or not just at the end, or God forbid, not at all, right? You really want to make sure that you have established points of feedback throughout the process. So let's recap quickly those 5 steps to writing a successful fundable grant in the new year when it comes to planning out how you're going to do that. So number 1, start early. That is crucially important. Number 2, solidify and validate your research idea. Number 3, build a strong team with clearly defined roles and responsibilities. Number 4, establish a grant writing project plan. And number 5, get feedback throughout the process. So if you found that helpful, we have a free resource library for you, which contains a lot of tools and frameworks and tutorials to help you write a stronger NIH grant. You can sign up for that by clicking the link in the video description, and we will see you next time.